week, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, published this big op-ed in the New York Times calling for warning labels on social media apps. He basically wants to put those labels like you see on alcohol or cigarettes on social media apps. The Surgeon General previously said in a May 2023 advisory that parents should immediately set limits on phone use and encourage Congress to swiftly develop health and safety standards for technology platforms. He also called on the tech companies to put other restrictions in place, like limiting notifications, eliminating things like the infinite scroll, which I think would be incredibly annoying if I had to use an app like that. And he said that all of this stuff preys on the developing brains of children and contributes to excessive use. Whatever excessive use means. He said, quote, "I don't think we can rely solely on the hope that the platforms can fix this problem on their own. They've had 20 years. First of all, they have not had 20 years. Facebook was barely founded 20 years ago and looked radically different. It didn't even have an app for years. The entire social media experience was desktop only. We didn't even get algorithmic feeds until the mid to late part of the 2010s. So this idea that they've had 20 years is absurd. Social media has evolved so rapidly, and yet these people's arguments against it have remained consistent. I mean, the same arguments that Dr. Murthy is making against TikTok and presumably Instagram, other social media platforms today, other people were making against MySpace back in 2003. Not to mention that a lot of the changes the Surgeon General wants to make and that lawmakers have advocated for in Congress could potentially have major free speech implications. Already, the Surgeon General's warning has been embraced by some people in Congress, including Richard Blumenthal from Connecticut, Marsha Blackburn from Tennessee. You might remember those two as the primary backers of the Kids Online Safety Act, which is a very concerning piece of legislation that could have wide implications on young people's speech and put significant restrictions on the internet. We'll get into that in other videos, but I really like this quote from Adam Kovacevic from Chamber of Progress. First of all, Chamber of Progress is a lobbying firm. They do tons of stuff for Facebook, so it's not like I'm treating them as a neutral party. But I think he makes a really good point. He said, legally speaking, these warning labels that the Surgeon General and potentially other lawmakers want to put on social media apps are no different from a Trump administration Surgeon General declaring that there needs to be a warning label on mainstream media because he deems it to be fake news. It's all the same abuse of the government's power to infringe on speech. Obviously, if something like this were to pass Congress, and it would be Congress that would have to do this, there would be a huge battle in the courts. But in the meantime, I think it's really important to examine the media coverage of all of this. Instead of questioning whether this recommendation is even based on science, what it would look like, how it would be implemented, and whether it would even achieve its goal, you saw celebration from pundits, academics, and other influential people in the media pushing this idea that social media and the internet is inherently harmful and dangerous to kids' health. I think The Atlantic has been doing some of the best coverage challenging these ideas, although it's worth noting they did help push a lot of this stuff in the first place. But Caroline Mims-Nice is a staff writer there. She covers technology. So I wanted to have her on to talk about some of her reporting, what she found, and just talk about the broader state of this panic around kids and technology.
Hi, I'm Caroline Mims-Nice, and I am a staff writer at The Atlantic, and I cover technology. So the U.S. Surgeon General, which is like the nation's top doctor, basically wrote an op-ed in the New York Times where he's calling for a warning label on social media. We don't totally know what that looks like right now. It would be really satisfying if we could scientifically just draw a line from like kid uses Instagram to anxiety or depression. But we just don't have that. Another big question about this proposal is what even is social media? Social media is not a monolith. There are a ton of different platforms that have social components. Like, is Roblox or Fortnite a social media platform? It's clearly a place where those are places where kids do get online and talk to other kids. Are they social? Do they require a warning? We don't know.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the whole problem. And it seems like, I mean, all of this just seems like a very like boomer, no offense to the boomers, but like a very out of touch and quite dated view of social media where like I feel like these people think of social media and the internet as this thing that you like log onto this app and then the app is making you miserable. And it seems to be most synonymous with like really Instagram, maybe TikTok, like Meta and Google. But ironically, it comes at a time when young people are spending more time on other apps like Discord and all of these other gaming platforms like you mentioned. And there's just social functionality all over. I always think of that girl that was banned from Twitter. She was like banned from using her phone. Her parents took it away. Then she started tweeting from her Samsung fridge. I just think the internet is increasingly like integrated into these other devices. And it seems like an impossible thing to police.
Let's see, you're using Instagram or your teen uses Instagram and they bypass it. Does that mean that anything bad that happens to them on Instagram is the fault of the kid and the parent versus the big tech company that may have some harms that they could possibly, by design, fix in some way? It just sort of, it creates an environment where the onus is completely on the end user and not at all on big tech.
Right. It's like use at your own risk. I think fear is what leads to panic, and specifically a moral panic. And I feel like that's really what we've entered into when it comes to kids and technologies, and specifically kids and internet use and social media. It just seems like it's sort of agreed upon. Like suddenly we woke up and it was just agreed upon that the internet is destroying young people's minds. And not only is that not what the research says, but it's kind of like you have to ask, who is pushing that narrative and why? It's come up quite recently, and there's not a lot of examination of like, well, why do we want to take all of these kids off the internet?
One thing that I was with the piece I was talking about with the Surgeon General's warning is that I do think it's important to situate it in this bigger backdrop of this moment. This year in particular, it does seem like there's a lot of concern and anxiety around kids and teens in particular, using the internet and trying to keep them safe. I mean, the start of this year, we had the big hearing in front of Congress where the tech CEOs were brought in and politicians on both sides were really like going after them. There's the dramatic moment where Mark Zuckerberg stood up and turned around and apologized to families in the audience. I think these dynamics are actually really familiar. I talked to Mimi Ito about this, who's a professor down at UC Irvine, who's been studying this stuff forever. And this is just a thing, like kids experiment with new technology. They tend to lead, they tend to help us lead the cultural uses of this technology. They're just more experimental. And then you've got the parents panicking and trying to take it away. It's a really familiar dynamic.
Yeah. It's very similar to video game stuff, where there was this idea that video games caused violence, right? And that video games were linked to violent behavior. Never mind, those links were never proven. There was no data. 20 years later, after that freak out, we recognize that these things are not inherently linked, and people of all ages use video games for fun. Video game playing is not linked to mental health problems or violent behavior or any of that. And so it just goes back to my broader point, which is that this is a huge moral panic, and treating all of these platforms the same is also a huge mistake. The Surgeon General talks about social media. It's putting platforms like Pinterest on the same level as something like Instagram or YouTube. Like these are all just such radically different platforms that serve such radically different goals. You know, when people use them, it seems so silly to try to slap a warning label on all of it. And it just, ultimately it's lip service. And I feel like what the Surgeon General did with this, he's just fanning the flames of this broader moral panic. Okay, Caroline, thank you so much for chatting. I'm so glad we got to discuss all of this. Where can people keep following your work and read your stuff?
I write for The Atlantic, so you can find my work there, and you can follow me on Twitter at @Mimsy.
Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments, and please don't forget to listen to my podcast, Power User. It's a weekly tech news show where we talk about all of these issues and more.